One bright Tuesday morning, Chris Hemsworth challenged everything at the old Midtown bus terminal in Boston. The sun had just fully risen, painting the bustling cityscape in clear, golden light. It was that perfect window of the day when business people hurried past with coffees in hand, families navigated the sidewalks with strollers, and a new wave of travelers poured into the bus station looking for connections that would take them to places near and far. On the street just outside, the scent of freshly brewed espresso drifted out of a corner cafe, colliding with the faint whiff of gasoline and the occasional hunk of impatient cars trying to beat the traffic. Yet, inside the terminal's high-ceilinged waiting area, a story of quiet heroism was about to unfold. One that would forever change how this public transit hub operated and how it treated every individual who stepped through its doors. Chris Hemsworth's arrival at the old Midtown bus terminal was unassuming. He wore a simple gray t-shirt, faded jeans, and a pair of well-worn sneakers. A lightweight backpack was slung over his shoulder, and a baseball cap shaded his recognizable face, just enough that most people breezed by without a second glance. He wasn't in town for a glitzy red carpet event or a blockbuster movie premiere. Instead, Chris had come to Boston for a charity meeting linked to a children's hospital, hoping to travel onward by bus to visit a community center in a nearby town that worked with youth struggling with literacy issues. The plan was to board a morning bus, catch up with local advocates, and quietly lend his support to a cause he believed in. No fanfare, no entourage, just a genuine desire to help. The old Midtown bus terminal, though not massive, was a labyrinth of gates and ticket counters. Its walls bore signs advertising upcoming discount travel deals and local events, while overhead announcements boomed every few minutes, calling out departure and arrival times. Rows of hard plastic chairs stretched from one end of the waiting hall to the other, providing momentary respite for the wary traveler. Small convenience shops lined the interior perimeter, offering newspapers, bottled water, and quick snacks. The building was old, but it had a certain charm. Stained glass windows near the roof let in shards of multicolored light that splayed across the floor like tiny rainbows. Chris Hemsworth took a moment to soak in the atmosphere, noticing the variety of people scurrying from place to place. There were students lugging suitcases, tourists snapping photos, and regular commuters rubbing sleep from their eyes while waiting for yet another day's long ride. Amid the din of rolling luggage and murmured conversations, Chris found Gate 12, where his bus was scheduled to depart in less than an hour. He settled into a seat off to the side, hoping for a peaceful few minutes to collect his thoughts and check messages on his phone before the trip. That's when he first saw Ethan Wheeler. Ethan was a man in his late 20s, tall but somewhat on the slender side, standing near the main ticket counter. He wore neatly pressed trousers and a button-down shirt, though the fabric had a few wrinkles from travel. By his side stood a devoted black Labrador, tail swishing gently on the tiled floor. The dog, the guide dog wearing a harness, kept its nose tilted upward, carefully scanning the environment for any potential obstacle. It was clear from the reflective cane poking out of Ethan's backpack that he was visually impaired, and the Labrador, whose name was Scout, was his eyes in these busy surroundings. Ethan waited patiently at the customer service kiosk, a white cane in one hand and Scout's leash in the other, hoping for a little help verifying his bus ticket and locating the correct gate. At first glance, this seemed like a routine request. Travelers ask employees for directions all the time, especially in labyrinthine terminals. But there was a tension in the air around Ethan that Chris, from his vantage point on the chairs by Gate 12, could sense immediately, even from a distance. A middle-aged man behind the counter, dress shirt, to slightly askew, seemed to be gesturing in annoyance, his face rigid with disapproval. Chris Hemsworth narrowed his eyes, trying to gauge if the tension was just normal business stress or something more disturbing. Curious, Chris rose, taking a few quiet steps closer to hear what was happening. Passengers moved in a steady flow around him, pulling him in and out of earshot. Yet, Chris managed to catch a snippet of the conversation, the staff member's voice, low and steely, uttering words like health code, dog not allowed, and liability. Chris instinctively felt his pulse quicken. He knew that in most places in the United States, guide dogs, properly trained and harnessed, were legally permitted in any public venue, including bus terminals, restaurants, and stores. There should have been no reason for Ethan or Scout to be denied service or singled out. Whatever argument was unfolding, it wasn't going in a fair direction. At that point, Chris Hemsworth noticed Ethan's expression, a mixture of embarrassment and quiet determination. The young man tried to respond calmly, explaining that Scout was his certified guide dog, thoroughly trained to navigate crowds and confined spaces and fully protected by disability access laws. But the staff member didn't seem to budge. Instead, the man motioned for Ethan to step aside. The tiny name tag pinned to his shirt read, Martin Hayes, in bold letters. Martin Hayes's face wore a look of barely contained contempt, as though he found Ethan's request both burdensome and offensive. A few other people in line were turning their heads, noticing something might be wrong, but everyone seemed hesitant to intervene or speak up. Some folks simply had that look of moral discomfort, lips pursed, eyes darting away, desperate to avoid confrontation. Chris shook his head, feeling a wave of disappointment. This can't be right, he thought, stepping closer. The airport, like echoes in the terminal, seemed to amplify Martin's increasingly harsh tone. Chris's instincts told him that if he didn't step in, Ethan's dignity would be further compromised, and the clock was ticking for both of them to find the right bus. Ethan tried once more, his voice surprisingly calm. Sir, I respect your concern for cleanliness or rules, but the law is on my side here. Scout is a trained guide dog, and I'm a fare-paying passenger. I'm only asking for assistance in finding the gate. Martin Hayes, however, was not interested. With a slight sneer curling at the corner of his mouth, he waved his hand dismissively. Look, I don't care what fancy piece of paper you have. Martin spat. I've been working here 20 years, and I know our policies. If I say it's a liability, then it's a liability. That dog doesn't belong here. At that very moment, Chris Hemsworth decided it was time to step forward. He wasn't looking for a public scene or to show off, but he had watched enough to understand a clear injustice was unfolding. He maneuvered through a few travelers, gently tapping a woman's shoulder to slip past. He approached the counter and stood next to Ethan, leveling a calm but firm gaze at Martin. Excuse me, Chris said quietly, addressing Martin Hayes. I think there's a misunderstanding. Guide dogs are certainly allowed in public transportation terminals across the state. And from what I'm hearing, this gentleman is simply asking for help locating his gate. He has every right to be here with his service dog. Martin shot him a look that clearly said, Who do you think you are? Though in that moment, he might not have recognized Chris Hemsworth as the international movie star. Martin's eyes flicked from Chris to Ethan, then to Scout. I don't recall asking for your opinion, he said curtly. This is my job, and I know what I'm doing. We have the right to deny service if we feel the rules are being violated. Chris's voice remained composed. No one's breaking any rules, sir. The law's quite clear about service animals, including guide dogs. If you'd like, I can help clarify that. Chris's accent and calm confidence seemed to unnerve Martin, whose expression darkened. By now, a small crowd had begun to form. Commuters, staff from nearby counters, a few curious onlookers. Faces showed different emotions: interest, confusion, empathy. There was a collective hush, a momentary lull in the usual roar of the terminal. And in that hush, the real story began to unfold, setting in motion a confrontation that would not only challenge Martin Hayes' deep-seated prejudice, but also highlight the power of standing up for others. even, or especially, when you yourself don't have to. It started innocently enough with subtle dismissals. Martin Hayes repeatedly ignored Ethan's attempts to confirm his bus gate, responding only in curt yes or no replies. Instead of elaborating on direction or offering assistance, Martin kept pointing vaguely toward the station's far side, as if instructing Ethan to go find it himself. At first, Ethan tried to handle the tension graciously. He had faced discrimination before, and he understood that not everyone was well informed about disability guidelines and service dog laws. So he offered polite clarifications. He explained how Scout was medically recognized as a service animal, how the dog had an official harness identifying her role, and how they had traveled through numerous terminals, airports, and buildings without issue. But Martin was not simply ignorant, he seemed resentful. Whenever Ethan would speak, Martin would find some pretext to shuffle papers, type furiously on his computer, or roll his eyes. Twice, Martin looked Ethan up and down with thinly veiled contempt, and once he seemed to be holding back laughter at the mention of official certification. To Ethan's credit, he tried to keep his composure, though Chris Hemsworth could sense the frustration building in the young man's posture. The stoic set of Ethan's jaw suggested he was used to encountering this kind of treatment from time to time. But that never made it easier. Seeing that Ethan was getting nowhere with official channels, Chris quietly stepped away for a moment. He headed toward a separate part of the counter, where two staffers in matching blue shirts were chatting. He asked them, in a lowered tone, if there was a manager he could speak to. One of the staffers, Linda Garcia, a petite woman with a warm smile, looked uneasy. She said Martin Hayes actually was one of the senior employees who oversaw much of the day-to-day operations at the terminal. Then she added, almost in a whisper, that he was known for making life difficult for certain passengers who didn't fit his idea of who should travel. Linda apologized on behalf of the station and admitted she wasn't sure what to do about him. She, like many other coworkers, feared Martin because he had been there so long and had built strong internal alliances. Chris Hemsworth nodded, thinking carefully. He asked Linda if she could share the official policy regarding service animals. She responded that, of course, the bus terminal recognized the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, which explicitly allowed guide dogs in stations and on the buses. Linda even offered to retrieve the printed policy from the office if Chris thought it might help. He thanked her for her willingness and requested she bring it. Then Chris turned and saw Ethan trying again to question Martin Hayes about what exactly the problem was and how to remedy it. The tension in the air was thick, and onlookers were turning their heads, hesitant but curious. After a few minutes, Linda returned with a short document referencing the Massachusetts state guidelines on service animals and the federal ADA policy. She handed it to Chris, who thanked her. Chris could see her eyes brimming with guilt over the entire situation. He couldn't help but think how employees like Linda would probably do the right thing if it weren't for the intimidation factor of someone like Martin. Chris walked back toward Ethan and Martin, politely intervening once more. Mr. Hayes, he said, deliberately using Martin's last name, I believe this documentation might resolve the confusion. He held out the policy. Martin glared, but took the paper anyway. According to this, and you should know this is standard in every public transportation facility, Ethan is entitled to bring his guide dog. Your terminal has an explicit policy stating that trained service animals are allowed to accompany their handlers. For a moment, it seemed Martin might relent. He scanned the page, lips moving in silent reading, but then he scoffed and tossed the paper onto the counter. We have local considerations, he insisted. There's always an exception to the rule, especially if we think safety is at risk. If something goes wrong, we get sued. He jerked a thumb in Ethan's direction. I'm not having it on my shift. Ethan exhaled slowly, struggling to maintain control. Scout let out a soft whine, sensitive to the tension. The dog remained seated at his side, harness straps taut, as if ready to guide Ethan anywhere. If only they could get proper assistance. Now the crowd was growing thicker. People who had been lined up at adjacent counters or waiting for different buzzes began to sense a confrontation. Some recognized Chris Hemsworth, though many were too focused on the spectacle of a staff member publicly chastising a visually impaired passenger to realize a famous actor was standing a few feet away. Yet, word spread in hushed whispers is that Chris Hemsworth, and the dynamic changed. A handful of folks drifted closer, now looking to Chris for leadership in this uncomfortable standoff. In the swirl of movement, a college student named Kevin Parker, wearing a Boston University sweatshirt, approached Ethan and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Hey, man," Kevin said quietly. "My aunt has a service dog too. If you need an escort around the station, I can help. You shouldn't have to deal with this." "It's not right." Ethan gave him a grateful nod. "Thanks. That means a lot. But it's not just about me getting to the bus. It's about standing up for the rights of every blind or disabled passenger who passes through here." Chris nodded firmly in agreement, stepping forward to back Ethan up. "Exactly," Chris said, turning back toward Martin. "Denying him service is discrimination. Mr. Hayes, you're stepping onto very dangerous legal ground. This man has every right to be here. I suggest we find a better way to handle the situation before it escalates further." Martin, however, was not in the mood for compromise. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair, and the rigid line of his shoulders announced that he thrived on authority. Decades on the job had hardened him into someone who believed power was best maintained by never backing down. Even when he was clearly in the wrong, his mouth set into a stubborn scowl as he folded his arms across his chest. For a moment, he locked eyes with Chris Hemsworth and perhaps recognized him. A flicker of realization passed over his face, but pride kept him from changing course. If anything, that flicker of recognition seemed to aggravate him further. He didn't want to be told what to do by some celebrity. "Look," Martin snapped. "We have over 10,000 travelers passing through here each week. If I made an exception for every dog lover who claims a medical need, we'd be overrun with animals, some of them not properly trained, some of them biting or messing up the floors. That's a health risk." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Scout is not a pet. She's a working guide dog, and my vision impairment is very real. Unless you're qualified to judge me medically." "Don't get smart," Martin cut in. "I've seen people fake these so-called service dogs. I have to look out for the station." Chris Hemsworth cleared his throat, stepping between them slightly. "Mr. Hayes, no one here is faking anything. And quite frankly, your suspicion is out of line. Guide dogs go through extensive training. This dog has the harness and the paperwork. If you have a specific question, ask it politely. Otherwise, you're just infringing on his rights." Despite the knot forming in his stomach, Ethan tried one last time to reason with Martin. "Sir, I'm heading to Hartford to visit family. My bus leaves in less than an hour. I need to confirm the correct departure gate and get any assist from staff to ensure I don't miss my bus. That's it. Once I board, I'm out of your hair." But Martin was steadfast. "I don't care if you're going across the street or across the country. That dog stays out. It's my call." A wave of muted shock and frustration rippled through the spectators. Some shook their heads, whispering among themselves. Others backed away, as though this was an unfolding drama they wanted no part of. Martin's hostility was so blatant that it rattled those who thought they'd seen everything in a public terminal. Yet, no one seemed to know exactly what to do about it, except Chris Hemsworth. Chris inhaled, reminding himself to keep his composure. "Mr. Hayes, I'm afraid you're making a serious mistake. It is not your call to override federal and state guidelines. Ethan's rights are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you refuse to comply, you could be jeopardizing not only your job, but also the reputation of this entire facility. Martin let out a mirthless chuckle. Is that some kind of threat? From you, of all people. What are you gonna do? Tweet about it. His tone dripped with cynicism. Ethan turned to Chris. I appreciate the support, Mr. Hemsworth, he said quietly. But maybe it's best I just find another way around. I've dealt with worse before. I can call a friend, maybe get a ride. Chris shook his head, placing a hand gently on Ethan's shoulder. No, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You shouldn't have to give up your seat on the bus you paid for because of prejudice. That's not how this works. We're going to make sure you get on your bus, and we're going to make sure that Martin here understands he can't discriminate against people who rely on service dogs. Kevin Parker, the college student, piped up in agreement. Yeah, absolutely. Someone call management or the local authorities if we have to. A tall woman in a business suit who'd been standing nearby folded her arms. Her name, gleaned from a badge clipped to her blazer, was Alicia Brooks. She was an attorney who specialized in labor law but had a decent grasp of disability rights. Actually, she said, stepping forward, the man is right. Federal law explicitly protects individuals with disabilities from being denied services. You're flirting with a lawsuit here, Mr. Hayes. I would strongly suggest you read the station's protocol more carefully. Now Martin looked around, unnerved by the tide turning against him. People were pulling out smartphones, quietly recording. More than a few recognized Chris Hemsworth, and some recognized Alicia Brooks from local news segments about labor disputes. Martin's expression hardened, but behind his narrowed eyes lurked a flicker of apprehension. Perhaps for the first time, he realized the magnitude of what he was doing, publicly denying a visually impaired man access to the bus station, ignoring both moral decency and legal standards. Still, old habits die hard. Instead of backing down gracefully, Martin leaned into his self-importance, barking, "Clear out, folks! This is official business, nothing to see here." But the onlookers didn't scatter as he had hoped. They remained, quietly resolute, watching to see how this confrontation would end. A wave of adrenaline surged through Chris Hemsworth. He recognized that this conflict was escalating. If Martin continued to hold his ground, the next step might involve police or station security. Chris realized it could all blow up into a chaotic scene that might overshadow the actual principle at stake. But the moment of truth was drawing near, and Chris Hemsworth was prepared to do what he could to ensure Ethan's rights were upheld, no matter how messy it got. Chris Hemsworth placed himself squarely in front of Ethan Wheeler, intending to serve as both a shield and an advocate. Martin Hayes' scowl deepened, his gaze cutting from Ethan's guide dog, Scout, to Chris's unwavering posture. By now, multiple voices were chiming in from the periphery. A middle-aged man wearing a military cap murmured that he had once been stationed overseas and seen veterans with service animals. A young mother with a toddler in her arms shook her head in dismay. Whispers of, "This is ridiculous," and "He has every right," floated through the air. The everyday hustle and bustle of the terminal took on a hush, as though the usual claimer recognized a bigger cause unfolding. For a moment, everything hung in a precarious balance. The seething refusal of Martin Hayes to budge, the growing resolve of Chris Hemsworth and other passersby, and Ethan Wheeler's anxious realization that if he missed his bus, he might miss a family gathering he'd long anticipated. Ethan had lost his sight as a child due to a rare eye condition, but he'd always prided himself on not letting that define his entire life. His independence had flourished with Scout's help, and traveling alone by bus was a point of personal triumph. The idea that someone could so casually unravel that independence was maddening. Ethan took a measured breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotion inside him. He felt anger, yes, but also humiliation. He hated being the center of a public dispute about something so fundamental as his right to navigate the world. He nodded to Chris, grateful for the solidarity, but his voice trembled slightly as he said, "This has happened before, but never so blatantly. Usually, a quick mention of the ADA is enough to clear things up." Chris nodded. Not this time, apparently. Then he turned his attention back to Martin, refusing to let his frustration boil over into aggression. "Mr. Hayes, if you continue down this path, you're going to find yourself on the losing side of a very public battle. I'm giving you every chance to do the right thing here." "Is that supposed to scare me?" Martin retorted. "Go ahead. Call the police or whoever you want. I know what I'm doing. This dog's not traveling under my watch." A hush spread through the watchers, replaced by the faint rumble of announcements echoing overhead. Chris Hemsworth quietly motioned to Alicia Brooks, the attorney, who slipped away and started dialing her phone to confirm the protocol with the local transit authority offices. Meanwhile, Linda Garcia, the sympathetic station employee, stepped gingerly toward Ethan. "Ethan, I'm so sorry about all this," she said, making sure she spoke loud enough for Martin to hear but without antagonizing him directly. "I want to help you find your gate. If you tell me your ticket details, I'll personally escort you to the correct bus." Martin's head snapped around. "Linda," he warned, "you're off the clock if you keep meddling." Linda paused, eyes lowered, but then she stood a little taller. "I won't let you bully me. Or him," she said firmly. "This is not how we should be treating passengers, especially those protected by law." Several bystanders offered nods of encouragement. Alicia, still on the phone, made a quick, urgent gesture, signaling that she'd gotten hold of someone who might intervene. Chris Hemsworth placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder again, leaning in to speak in a low voice. "It's going to be okay. We have enough witnesses and the law is on our side. One way or another, we'll get you on your bus." Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. He tried to calm Scott with a gentle pet on the dog's head. "You're doing good," he whispered to his loyal companion. "Just hang in there." Suddenly, Martin Hayes hopped down from behind the counter, pushing his way past a startled elderly couple. He strode right up to Ethan and Chris, refusing to keep even a polite distance. "Enough. This station is private property, and I can ask you to leave if I feel you're creating a disturbance, duh." His voice was raised, and every syllable echoed, turning heads across the entire terminal. "Now get out, or I'll have security escort you out." Chris took a slight step back, not out of fear, but to give Ethan some space, anticipating any potential confrontation. The tension in the room skyrocketed. A few people pulled out their phones to record more openly now, capturing Martin's outburst in high definition. The looming question hung in the air. Would Martin physically remove Ethan or his dog? But before Martin could do anything brash, Alicia Brooks returned, phone call complete, and stepped right into the middle of the tension. She raised her voice, crisp and authoritative. "Mr. Hayes, I've spoken with the Massachusetts Transit Authority. They've confirmed that your denial of service is a direct violation of federal law. If you continue to refuse, the next step is a formal complaint to the Department of Justice and immediate escalation. This can become a federal case." Martin whirled around to face her. "I don't care who you talk to." She cut him off smoothly. "Then you're risking everything. Your job, this station's reputation, potentially hundreds of thousands in fines. Do you really want to continue with that? Because the authorities will be here soon if you don't comply." Chris Hemsworth caught the slightest quiver in Martin's otherwise steely expression. Fear was creeping in. He was, at least on some level, starting to comprehend the severity of what he'd done. Yet, his pride still held him in its iron grip. "Letty, you can't scare me with big talk," he said, though the bravado in his tone seemed forced. Ethan, feeling the hostility from Martin radiate in waves, was done trying to be polite. He raised his voice, calm but resolute. I have every right to be here, and I will be here until I board my bus. If you lay a hand on my dog or me, I'll be the first to file that complaint. I have the entire station as witnesses. A ripple of agreement swept through the crowd. Kevin Parker, the college student, stepped forward and nodded in solidarity. We're not letting this man push you around. At that exact moment, 2 uniformed security guards emerged from a corridor in response to the commotion. Their gold badges glinted under the fluorescent lights. They looked from Martin Hayes, standing stiff and angry, to Chris Hemsworth and Ethan Wheeler, surrounded by onlookers. One of the guards, a fit middle-aged woman named Officer Janice Conway, approached cautiously. What's going on here? She asked, scanning the crowd for a sign of trouble. Martin seized the opportunity to try to regain the upper hand. Officer, these men are causing a disturbance, refusing to leave when asked. The dog is not allowed. I need them escorted out. Now! Chris Hemsworth took a small step forward, lifting his hand politely to get the guard's attention. Officer Conway, my name is Chris Hemsworth. This passenger, Ethan Wheeler, is visually impaired and has a certified guide dog. We're here because Mr. Hayes is denying him the right to board his bus with his service animal, which is illegal. The second guard, Officer Darnell Price, stood by Janice Conway's side and took in the scene, his brow furrowed. Officer Conway glanced at Ethan's harnessed dog, noting all the standard markings of a legitimate guide dog. Is that correct, Mr. Hayes? You're denying him access with a service dog? Martin huffed, crossing his arms again. Yes, I am. We have health regulations that override. Conway cut him off, her voice surprisingly firm. AD law supersedes any so-called health regulations you're citing. Service animals are permitted in this facility. You know that. We've been briefed on it countless times. Officer Price nodded in agreement. We only remove people when there's an actual threat or disturbance. A man with a guide dog is not a threat. Chris spotted a flicker of panic behind Martin's eyes. The senior staffer had expected station security to blindly follow his directive, but instead they were reiterating the same points Chris and Ethan had made. Martin tried a last-ditch strategy. He's causing a scene. Ask any witness here. This has been a nightmare for the last half hour. The bus is probably left by now anyway. He glared triumphantly at Ethan, as though hoping that the missed departure would settle the matter. But Linda Garcia, who had quietly checked the schedule, piped up. Actually, the bus was delayed 20 minutes. It's still at gate 14. Ethan can still make it if we hurry. The crowd murmured excitedly at that piece of good fortune. Ethan's face lit up with relief. Chris Hemsworth broke into a grin at the news, feeling a sense of renewed hope. Even in the midst of conflict, the timing was still on their side. Officer Conway turned to Ethan, adopting a professional but compassionate tone. Sir, do you still want to board that bus? Ethan nodded fervently. Wes, officer, I do. I just want to get to Hartford. That's it. Conway sighed and glared at Martin. Then you have every right to go. And if Mr. Hayes continues to obstruct you, that's a violation. It's our job to uphold the law, not break it. Officer Price stepped toward Ethan and motioned for him to follow. Let me guide you, sir. He glanced at Scout. Beautiful dog, very well trained. Thank you, Ethan replied, heart pounding. This was the first official validation he'd received all morning that his rights were upheld within this building. He reached out, accepted Officer Price's offered guidance, and signaled Scout to proceed. The dog stood and wagged her tail gently, ready to lead her handler onward. But as Ethan prepared to leave the confrontation behind and head toward gate 14, Martin Hayes stepped in front of them, his face contorted with desperation. No, Martin hissed, refusing to yield. I've worked here for 20 years. I decide who goes through these gates. At this point, the crowd erupted in protest. Shouts of, "Let them pass," and "Shame on you," flew from different corners of the gathering. Some people began booing Martin. The tension soared into chaos as Martin planted himself, arms spread wide, blocking Ethan's path. Chris Hemsworth quickly interposed himself between Martin and Ethan to prevent any potential physical harm. Martin lashed out with a frustrated shove, an impulsive, desperate move that caused a sudden gasp across the terminal. Chris, not expecting the push, staggered back a step, catching himself before he collided with Ethan. Scout barked once, sensing that her handler was in peril, though she stayed close to Ethan's side. Well trained not to lunge or snap, Officer Conway sprang into action, grabbing Martin's arm. That's enough, Mr. Hayes! We can't allow physical aggression here. Step aside. She tried to pull him away, but Martin resisted, still convinced of his authority. His face turned red as he jerked free for a moment, glaring at Chris with a look of utter defiance. Ethan's voice rose above the tumult, firm yet quivering with adrenaline. Stop! Just stop this. I'm a blind traveler with a guide dog, and all I want is to board my bus. Why is that so hard to understand? For a heartbeat, a hush fell, as though Ethan's simple, heartfelt plea cut through the swirling confusion. Then Martin spat out a vicious line. Because I'm not letting some dog. Officer Price swiftly intervened, stepping between Martin and Ethan once again. You are done, he told Martin firmly. I will personally escort you to the manager's office and file a report on your conduct. If you keep resisting, we'll call the police to remove you. This is assault. Among other charges, the prospect of actual police involvement finally broke something in Martin's stance. His face twitched, and his shoulders sagged ever so slightly. The reality that he had shoved a passenger, one accompanied by a service dog, was sinking in. His pride had led him down a disastrous road, and he was now face to face with the possibility of losing his job or facing legal consequences. Chris Hemsworth, chest still heaving from the adrenaline, steadied himself. He locked eyes with Martin and, in a quiet, resolute tone, said, It didn't have to be like this, Mr. Hayes. Discrimination, even if you think it's just about a dog, has consequences. I hope you realize that now. Martin looked away, unable to muster a reply. Officer Conway and Officer Price took him by the arm, steering him away from Ethan's path. As they led him toward a narrow corridor, presumably connected to the administrative offices, Martin's final words, muttered under his breath, sounded pitifully like, I was just doing my job. With Martin finally removed from the scene, the tension in the terminal loosened its chokehold. The bystanders exhaled audible sighs of relief. Some clapped politely or patted Ethan on the shoulder in solidarity. Others turned their attention to Chris Hemsworth, gratitude shining in their eyes for how steadfastly he had defended Ethan's rights. Alyssa Brooks, the attorney, stepped forward and addressed the gathered crowd. Let this be a reminder that we all have a responsibility to speak out when we see injustice. If you ever feel unsure about disability rights, remember that federal law protects individuals with service animals. No one should have to endure harassment to access public transportation. Then, tears of relief brimming in his eyes, gave Chris a shaky smile. Thank you, he said, voice thick with emotion. I can't believe how intense that got. Chris placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder again. You have nothing to apologize for. You were just standing up for your right to travel with dignity. I'm sorry you had to go through that, but I'm glad we could help. Kevin Parker, the college student, also approached, grinning widely. Dude, you were amazing, he said to Ethan. Scout was so calm. She really is the best. Ethan reached down to scratch Scout behind the ears. The dog's tail thumped happily. She is. I just want to board my bus now. I feel like I ran a marathon. Linda Garcia wiped her brow. The bus is still there. Let's get you to gate 14. I'll walk you, and maybe we can all breathe easier once you're safely on board. The group started moving as a small unit, guiding Ethan gently through the parting crowd. Chris Hemsworth walked alongside him. determined to see the matter through to the very end. Officer Price followed at a distance, ensuring no further harassment came Ethan's way. Alicia Brooks, phone in hand, busied herself drafting a statement she intended to submit to the Transit Authority, highlighting the incident and recommending immediate policy checks. Kevin Parker hung back a little, capturing a few final moments on his phone, wanting to document how the community had rallied behind Ethan. As they approached Gate 14, Linda double-checked with the driver, who was aware of the delay and had no issue at all with a guide dog on board. The driver, in fact, looked mortified when Linda explained what had transpired. "I'm so sorry," the driver said to Ethan. "Of course, Scout is welcome. Grab a seat up front if you'd like. It'll be easier for you and her to get settled." At last, Ethan Wheeler stepped onto the bus. Scout guided him gently up the steps, nose leading the way, harness secure. He found a seat near the front and exhaled deeply, as though the weight of the entire terminal's hostility had been lifted from his shoulders. Chris Hemsworth stood in the aisle for a moment, wanting to say goodbye. "Thank you, Chris," Ethan murmured, using his first name now. "You could have just ignored the situation, but you spoke up. You made a real difference today, not just for me, but for anyone who might face the same type of discrimination." Chris's eyes softened. "Thank you for your courage. I'm sorry it escalated so far, but I'm glad it turned out okay. Travel safe, Ethan, and keep speaking up. Though hopefully you won't have to as much in the future." They shared a warm handshake before Chris stepped off the bus. As the vehicle rumbled to life, heading toward the terminal exit, Chris and Linda stood on the platform, watching Ethan depart. A sense of quiet triumph lingered in the air. The moment felt bigger than just one individual's right to board a bus. It felt like a stand had been taken against all forms of prejudice. A reminder that a single voice, or a united few, can indeed make a world of difference. Yet, a reckoning remained for the old Midtown bus terminal. Martin Hayes had been marched away by security, and Alyssa Brooks was already drafting a formal complaint. Chris Hemsworth suspected that the story would not end here. The fervent reaction of bystanders, coupled with the video evidence, meant that local news outlets would likely pick up the incident. In the coming days, the bus terminal's management would be forced to confront more than just negative publicity. They'd have to confront their own flawed policies and the culture that had enabled an employee like Martin Hayes to behave so brazenly for so long. Chris turned to Linda. "Is there someone I can talk to? A station manager or someone higher up in the transit organization? I'd like to make sure they're fully aware of this." Linda gave a small nod. "Wes, the general manager's office is on the second floor. Name is Diane Roberts. She might want to know exactly what happened." Chris sighed. "Let's go talk to her. Then, we have to make sure Ethan's not the last person who benefits from what happened here today." Within half an hour, Chris Hemsworth found himself in a modest but tidy office on the second floor of the bus terminal. Through the window, he could see the bustle of the station below, people crisscrossing gates, their journeys uninterrupted by the drama that had just taken place. Diane Roberts, a professional-looking woman in her 40s with short auburn hair, sat behind a desk stacked with schedules and paperwork. The nameplate read, "Diane Roberts, General Manager." Her eyes were filled with a mixture of concern and shock as Chris, Linda, and Alyssa Brooks recounted the ordeal in detail. When they finished, Diane took a moment to rub her temples, visibly upset. "I can't believe Martin went that far," she said in a weary voice. "We've had complaints about his attitude before, but nothing this severe. Denying a guide dog entry is against everything we stand for. And then to resort to physical aggression. This is beyond unacceptable." Alyssa Brooks leaned forward, clasping her hands together. "We appreciate that you're taking this seriously, Ms. Roberts. But the fact remains that it happened. He nearly cost a blind passenger his bus ride. He assaulted Chris Hemsworth, and he tried to bully all of us. One of your own staff members, Linda here, was frightened to speak up. That indicates a systemic problem. Linda lowered her gaze, clearly uncomfortable discussing her fear in front of her boss. Diane frowned sympathetically. Linda, I'm sorry you felt you couldn't come to me sooner. Rest assured, we won't brush this under the rug. Disciplinary action against Martin is inevitable. But more than that, we have to review our training protocols and station culture. Chris cleared his throat gently. I understand workplaces can develop challenging dynamics over years, but something has to change so that no other passenger with a disability faces what Ethan faced today. Even the guards had to step in. We need to set new standards for how staff interacts with travelers, especially those with service animals. Diane nodded with conviction, making a few notes on a legal pad. I will be holding an emergency meeting with the transit authority. We'll do a full review of our station policies and retrain our staff on ADA compliance. I promise you, changes will be made. This station has to be a safe, welcoming place for everyone. Alicia Brooks gave a satisfied nod. We'll also be filing a formal complaint to ensure that the higher-ups see the urgency. Diane glanced at Chris Hemsworth. Mr. Hemsworth, thank you for intervening. If you hadn't been there, I hate to think how this might have turned out. I'm sorry for what you experienced. We value all our passengers and certainly never wanted to put anyone, celebrity or not, through that. Chris shrugged. I only did what anyone should do in that situation. I'm just glad Ethan got on his bus. As the meeting wrapped up, Diane escorted them to the door. Before parting, she insisted, We'll let you know of any updates. Please keep in touch. She handed over a business card, exchanging contact details with Alicia Brooks and Linda Garcia. Chris pocketed the card. Thank you, Ms. Roberts. We'll be following up. We're counting on you to make this right. Then Linda, and Alyssa headed back downstairs. Some employees milled around, whispering about the incident. The entire atmosphere felt unsettled yet charged with possibility. Word was already spreading that Martin Hayes had been temporarily suspended pending a formal investigation, with rumors that he might face legal consequences. A few staffers approached Linda to thank her for speaking out. One even gave Chris an appreciative smile, saying, It's about time someone took a stand. Alicia gave Chris's arm a gentle squeeze. Well, I think I'll head out. If you need me for anything else, you've got my number. She turned to Linda. And if you need legal backup or want to come forward with your own concerns about Martin or others, call me anytime. Linda nodded, eyes bright with gratitude. Thank you. I might do that. There's a lot of fear here. People worried about repercussions. But I think seeing the support from you, from Chris, from the passengers, it's given us courage. Chris, feeling the weight of the morning's events, offered a warm farewell to Alicia. Soon after, he said goodbye to Linda as well, thanking her for her integrity and her willingness to help Ethan. As Linda went back to work, Chris made his way out of the old Midtown bus terminal, weaving through the midday crowds. Now that the adrenaline had ebbed, he felt a wave of exhaustion. He checked the time and realized that the bus he'd planned to catch himself had long since departed. Another would be coming, but he decided to grab some coffee and reflect on everything that had just happened before planning his next move. Yet, as he stepped onto the city sidewalk, a few random pedestrians recognized him, eyes flicking with curiosity as if to say, "What's a Hollywood star doing at a bus terminal in Boston?" He offered a polite smile, occasionally giving a small nod. A group of teenage fans on the corner waved excitedly. Chris paused, gave a quick wave in return, and then turned a corner, letting the city swallow him back into anonymity. In the days that followed, the events at the old Midtown bus terminal took on a life of their own. Cell phone videos captured by onlookers circulated on social media, garnering thousands of views within hours. Local news outlets picked up the footage, running headlines like, "Bus Terminal Staff Ordini Service to Blind Passenger," and "Actor Chris Hemsworth Steps in to Protect Guide Dog Access." The coverage ignited a public outcry, especially from advocacy groups for the visually impaired and disability rights organizations. They called for immediate reforms in how transportation hubs trained their employees. Ethan Wheeler, reached by reporters in Hartford, spoke candidly about the ordeal. He emphasized that the real victory lay not in the involvement of a celebrity, but in the collective refusal of bystanders to tolerate discrimination. "We all have a responsibility to each other," he said in a televised interview. "If you see someone being denied basic rights, speak up. You might be the only voice they have in that moment." Chris Hemsworth received a flurry of messages online, some praising him for stepping in, others sharing their own stories of traveling with service animals. He felt humbled by the attention, but also aware that the root issue went well beyond this one incident. He decided to use the momentum to amplify the conversation about disability rights, posting a measured statement on his social media account. "Everyone deserves the freedom to travel safely and with dignity." When we see discrimination, it's our duty to speak out, whether we're a celebrity or not. Grateful to have witnessed how a caring community came together at the old Midtown bus terminal. Let's keep that unity alive. Meanwhile, Diane Roberts and the Transit Authority launched a comprehensive review of the bus terminal's operations. They convened training sessions for all staff, mandating refreshers on ADA regulations and ethical customer service. A brand new internal hotline was set up for employees to report any discriminatory behavior from coworkers or supervisors, complete with protections against retaliation. Linda Garcia found herself somewhat of a local hero among her colleagues, admired for standing up to Martin Hayes' intimidation. She was promoted to a supervisory role, tasked with helping shape a more inclusive environment within the station. Martin Hayes, on the other hand, was suspended indefinitely while investigations into his conduct proceeded. Rumors circulated that he might be facing more than just losing his job. Potential civil liability for assaulting Chris and harassing Ethan was on the table. The station made it clear that they would not shield him from legal consequences. Some employees felt sympathy for him, citing personal hardships and a divorce that had hardened his demeanor over the past few years. But most recognized that no amount of personal stress justified his actions. By refusing to reflect on his attitude, Martin had sealed his fate. In time, the bus terminal introduced new signage at every entrance, clearly stating that service animals were welcome and referencing the pertinent laws to reassure travelers. Staffers began offering more proactive assistance, going out of their way to ask passengers with disabilities if they needed help locating gates or baggage claim. Although not every employee was thrilled about the extra training or new protocols, the shift was undeniable. The old Midtown bus terminal was slowly transforming into a model for accessibility. An ironic twist, given its checkered history with Martin Hayes. Ethan Wheeler kept in touch with Linda Garcia and Chris Hemsworth in the weeks that followed. He sent messages about how his family reunion in Hartford was wonderful and how he felt a newfound sense of empowerment after the ordeal. "My life won't ever be the same," he wrote in one message to Chris. "In part because I saw what happens when people unite against discrimination. I hope we can keep the conversation going." Chris replied warmly, urging Ethan to keep sharing his story. "Change starts with real experiences," Chris wrote. "The more people realize that behind every disability is a human life full of aspirations, the sooner stereotypes and prejudice fade." Gradually, the public hype around the incident died down, overshadowed by the next wave of headlines. But lasting change had taken root at the bus terminal and beyond. Other transportation hubs across the state followed suit, reevaluating how they trained staff to interact with disabled passengers. the local government put together a short PSA featuring Ethan Wheeler and Scout, highlighting the do's and don'ts of approaching someone with a guide dog. Chris Hemsworth, while back in Los Angeles for work, did a quick Zoom cameo in the PSA, lending his star power to spread the message further. For Chris, it was a reminder that sometimes the most impactful moments of celebrity use aren't glamorous fundraisers or marquee events, but everyday encounters where a recognized voice can tip the balance toward justice. For Ethan, it was a testament to the resilience of his spirit and the unstoppable loyalty of Scout. For Linda and many of her co-workers, it was a watershed moment, freeing them from an atmosphere of fear and showing them that the right action can win out, even against entrenched patterns. If this story touched your heart, share it with others who need inspiration. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. New powerful story drops every evening starting tomorrow. Hit subscribe so you won't miss a single one. Take the kindness challenge. Share how you'll make a difference in your community. Whether it's helping someone find their way or speaking up against injustice, every small step counts. Remember the lessons of the old Midtown bus turn. Terminal discrimination thrives in silence, but it cannot withstand the chorus of many voices saying, "Enough." Let's keep that chorus alive, so that the next Ethan Wheeler, with the next Scout by his side, can travel this world free from fear and brimming with hope.